All right, so very last video on our very last topic for Biology 228, and it's a good one because it's just one slide. So we just finished up talking about the ovarian cycle and what's happening in the ovaries on a monthly basis. And what we're going to finish up with is talking about the uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle is looking at what's happening in the uterus on a monthly cycle. So the uterus is a hollow muscular organ that is lined with a very soft vascular tissue that's perfect for a fertilized egg or a zygote to implant in and complete its development. And what we see is that there are 3 phases to the uterine cycle that are affecting that inner lining of the uterus. So the first of these is what's known as the menstrual phase. If you look at this diagram down here, it's kind of showing you the physical changes that are happening with that inner lining during each of these 3 phases. So we've got the days down here divided into phases. So our first phase is menstrual, second phase is proliferative, third phase is secretory, and on this axis we've got the actual thickness of that lining in the inside of the uterus. And so during the menstrual phase, this is days 1 through 5 in a female cycle, so this is when menses is actually happening, we're seeing a decrease in the thickness of that inner vascular lining. So that's what's actually being released through the process of menstruation. We've got that lining that's breaking down. Days 6 through 14 are what's known as the proliferative phase. So proliferative phase, because during this time following menstruation, we've actually got that lining in the uterus starting to build back up. So it's starting to thicken again in preparation for the possible implantation of a zygote. The proliferative phase ends at day 14 with ovulation, and then following that, we move into what's known as the secretory phase. So this is a time where that lining of the uterus is still continuing to build up to some extent, but really is kind of being maintained in preparation for a zygote to implant there. If fertilization of an egg does not happen, then we actually see these blood vessels that supply this tissue starting to kink, cutting off the blood supply to that tissue. The tissue starts to break down, and then it's released, and of course that's going to lead to a decrease in the thickness of the tissue as we move back over into the menstrual phase where menses starts again. One of the things that I like about this particular slide is it allows you to kind of put together everything that we've talked about with the uterine cycle and also with the ovarian cycle as well, and kind of match those all up with timing. So if you're kind of struggling, feeling like the hormonal part of this, the HPGA of females was really kind of difficult, if you can master these diagrams, you don't have to really remember it because it's all kind of here given to you. So I'm going to start down here with what's going on in days 1 through 5 in the uterus. We've got a shedding of that inner lining of the endometrium as menses is actually occurring. And we also talked about the fact when we were in the ovarian cycle and looking at what happens in the ovaries, that this is the time when a primordial follicle starts to mature. So it becomes a primary follicle and then a secondary follicle, right? And as this is happening, there's really nothing in the ovaries to produce either estrogen or progesterone because there's no corpus luteum that's present, and the corpus luteum is what produces progesterone, and there aren't any granulosa cells. And granulosa cells are one of the 2 things, right, that produce estrogen. So we've got estrogen levels and progesterone levels that are really low during days 1 through 5 of the cycle, and the reason for that is we've got primordial follicle developing into a primary follicle, and from there into a secondary follicle. And until we have that secondary follicle with granulosa cells, we're not going to have any estrogen being produced. If you look right here in the proliferative phase, so this is that time again when the inner lining of the uterus is starting to build up, and that is correlated with the time that we're going from the secondary follicle to the vesicular, the Graafian, the mature, whatever you want to call it, follicle. So at this point in time, we now have estrogen that's being produced by the follicle because we have those granulosa cells. This estrogen is what causes this inner lining of the uterus, the endometrium, to start to build up. You can see, if you correlate this with what's going on in this graph of estrogen and progesterone and how they're changing over time, that estrogen is in fact starting to increase, and that's because of the granulosa cells that are present. You'll also see, if you look up here and correlate that with this graph of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, that estrogen has a negative feedback on these two hormones, and you can see them starting to decrease as estrogen is increasing. When we hit a peak point, so here's that peak point when estrogen's at its highest level it's going to be in the entire cycle. Remember that suddenly we get this change from negative feedback on FSH and LH to positive feedback. So you can see that matches up with a big spike in the levels of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in the body. And remember, it's the spike in those hormones that causes ovulation. So that's matched up in time with these changes that are happening in estrogen levels and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. That's also the end of the proliferative phase in the uterus. So we move into the secretory phase in the uterus following ovulation. This is the same time frame as the luteal phase in the ovaries. So the corpus luteum is starting to develop. Remember, following ovulation, those granulosa cells were destroyed, so estrogen levels started to decrease until we have that corpus luteum, and then it starts to produce estrogen, so they start to rise again. It's also producing progesterone, so we see progesterone being produced in this cycle, and estrogen and progesterone together help to build up, again, this endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, but they also help to maintain it. So we see some buildup going on, but some maintenance of these two hormones as well. You'll also remember that estrogen and progesterone negatively feed back on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So the rise in these two hormones is correlated with a decrease, or it matches up with a decrease in luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. After about 10 days, our corpus luteum starts to degenerate. So when it starts to degenerate, we're going to see a decrease in estrogen and progesterone levels because it's no longer able to produce them. You'll notice this matches up with a slight increase in luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone because as these hormones decrease, they're no longer providing negative feedback on luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and those hormones start to increase. But the other thing that you'll see matching up with this is the corpus luteum degenerates and we're not having estrogen and progesterone produced anymore, is that we see the kinking of the blood vessels in the endometrium and the cutoff of the blood supply, which causes that endometrium to start to break down. So estrogen built up the endometrium, estrogen and progesterone maintain the endometrium. When we no longer have estrogen and progesterone because the corpus luteum has degenerated, that's the signal for that endometrium to start to break down and head us right back over here to day one where menses begins in this cycle.